Okay, everybody, welcome to this expert masterclass. It's really great to see everybody. I am Dave Cullen. I'm the program manager of the Emerging Voices Network. Just to remind everybody that we will be recording the masterclass today. If you would prefer not to be on camera, but you wish to ask a question using your voice, you're very welcome to in the Q&A, or you can post questions in the chat. I am delighted to introduce our speaker today, Matt Korda. Matt is the Associate Director for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. He co-authors the Nuclear Notebook, which is an authoritative open source estimate of global nuclear forces and trends. I would say, I don't think I'm alone in thinking this is the gold standard for that. Internationally, he's also an associate senior researcher with the Weapons of Mass Destruction program at the Stockholm Institute. Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. He co-authors the nuclear weapons chapters for the annual SIPRI Yearbook. He previously worked for the Arms Control, Disarmament and WMD Non-Proliferation Centre at NATO HQ in Brussels. And his work has made headlines across the globe. Matt will speak first of all, and then we will have time for Q&A. You are very welcome to raise a hand if you would like to ask a question or put a question in the chat, and we'll come to the questions after Matt has spoken. So over to you, Matt.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Declan. Thank you, Kiara. It's great to see folks here. Some folks I've met before, others I have not. So it's really nice to see you and meet you all. Thanks so much for having me and for, I guess, that very kind introduction, Dave. So for folks who don't know the work that we do at the Federation of American Scientists, we're one of the oldest nuclear policy organizations in the world. We were founded by scientists who came out of the Manhattan Project, who sort of realized subsequently that science should be used for the benefit of humanity rather than to its detriment. And so out of this sort of core nuclear disarmament work that we're known for was born and continues to this day in sort of different elements. And one of the sort of the core missions that we have is to produce, as much as we can tell, the best unclassified and authoritative estimates of global nuclear forces. And the way that we do that is by using open sources. And so we'll talk today about what is open source information, how do we get it, why is it important, and then we'll talk about some examples of how it can be used. And then really we'll open it up for just a conversation and a discussion about the utility of this kind of information and its, drawbacks and those sorts of things. So I will start off. I have some slides. I'm going to try and make sure that I can do this correctly. Bear with me for 1 second here. And I think everyone here should be seeing the big screen, the big slides. Amazing. Okay. So let's get started with that, right? So this is sort of our main research output. Maybe folks have seen this before. This is the kind of the big chart that a lot of our research sort of rolls up into, and really this is I think something that's really important for me to start off by talking about is that every single thing that we do, whether it is monitoring an individual silo, right, whether it is looking at a particular budget line item, all of that rolls up ideally into this sort of big chart, right? So those little data points, assumptions, pieces of information that we get, right, through open sources, those help inform the broader estimates that we make about what countries are building, how they're deploying them, why, that sort of thing. This type of work is getting a lot more important, right? Because as tensions between nuclear armed countries continue to rise, those same countries are also becoming a lot more opaque about their nuclear forces. And so this requires, I think, investigators to really sort of like ferret out those crucial bits of information about how arsenals are changing. And so we'll talk a little bit about, how we do that work. But first, I guess just a really quick overview about why this work is important, right? So I mentioned the opacity, but really, there are a few important things here, right? So, I guess one question that I will often get, perhaps occasionally from folks within the defense complex, is like, why do you do this, right? Shouldn't some bits of information about nuclear weapons be kept secret? And my response to that is, I actually think very few data points about nuclear weapons need to be kept secret, right? Of course, we don't want people to um, know exactly, how to build one, right? Perhaps that should be kept secret. Perhaps the security measures that are used to guard them, maybe those should be kept secret, right? We don't want that becoming public information. But pretty much everything else, or most other things, should, I think, be out in the public. And the reason for that is because, a lot of these details are relating to how countries interact with each other, right? How they practice politics, how they practice their nuclear policies. It also has to do with domestic democracy and budget issues, right? That people living in those countries deserve to know about. And then a few other things, right? So it mitigates strategic risk because from our perspective, ambiguity over nuclear stockpiles and how those nuclear weapons are going to be employed could potentially increase the potential for miscalculation during a nuclear crisis. It also combats misinformation, threat inflation, and fear mongering, right? So when we know what other countries have, it means that we don't have to resort to worst case scenarios about, what it is that they're going to deploy, right? We're not sort of falling back on our worst human instincts, and rather we're able to inject a sense of predictability and transparency into the debate. And the last thing that I'll note is that it empowers key stakeholders, right? So a lot of this information is classified, right? And so when, for example, US and Chinese diplomats are meeting to talk about their nuclear policies and stockpiles, they're not bringing out classified details to talk to each other about, but they are able to rely on this sort of third party estimate that we're able to provide to sort of indicate, okay, well, here's, this may not be 100% accurate, but it's mostly, it's good enough for us to have a conversation about, the differences between our stockpiles. And so these are, I guess, some of the reasons why this work is important. So let's talk about open source information. What makes something open source? This is a very confusing and complicated question because there is no universal definition for what constitutes an open source. There are differences between how different stakeholders will think about it. We'll talk about those. And there are often even open disputes about what kinds of acronyms to use. You might see something like OSINT or OSI or OS, right? OSINT meaning open source intelligence. OSI commonly used as open source information, or just OS, right, for open source. We tend to use, OSINT just because it's the one that's used most commonly, but there are sort of subtle distinctions here, right? Referring to the differences between information, which is raw data, and intelligence, which is when an analyst actually interprets that data and produces an intelligence product, right? So you may sort of see all these different acronyms throughout, as you sort of continue in this field. But I think something important to note is there is not a universal definition for this, but let's dig a little bit deeper into what OSINT is and what OSINT is not. So is OSINT always Googleable? Well, search engines may typically be where we start our investigations, but there are a lot of types of data that are not easily Googleable that are still available for collection, right? So for example, phone records, passport data, buying things on the gray market. We also have social media data, our military contracts. These may not necessarily be Googleable, but you might need access by making accounts or through specialized contract databases. This does, however, count as OSINT, right? So it's not necessarily always something that's Googleable. It's just something that is kind of out in the public and available for you to access. So is OSINT always Googleable? No. Is OSINT always unclassified? Also no, right? While most of the information we may be dealing with is unclassified, that isn't always the case, right? And just because data is out in the open, it does not mean that it's unclassified, right? So for example, information that's posted on WikiLeaks remains classified. They have not been declassified, they have been leaked, right? So, but for those of us who don't have clearances, this doesn't actually matter. But if you have a clearance and you're accessing a WikiLeaks document, you would technically be improperly accessing and handling classified documents, right? So is it always unclassified? No, right? We can still use it. It's out in the public, but it is not always necessarily unclassified. Is it always free? No. Paywalls represent a barrier to accessing data, but they can still be bypassed, right, by just buying them, right? So for example, our team pays for certain types of satellite imagery, subscriptions to journals and databases, research materials, other types of data. So it is not always necessarily free. Is it always legal? Yes. Well, there is a lot of gray area with some of these previous factors. Legality is the one common denominator for open source information. Something can be considered OSINT if you can access it through non-clandestine means. So no spying, no hacking, no social engineering, no breaking and entering. So a brief overview about what constitutes OSINT, what it is, and what it isn't. Why do we need this for nuclear weapons, right? This is because, as I mentioned earlier, most nuclear armed states keep a really close hold on information about their nuclear arsenals, right? They generally only release information that they want people to see. That being said, there are some really significant differences in the way that nuclear armed states manage nuclear weapons information. It is a bit of a spectrum. I have tried to very crudely plot it here. This is a tremendous oversimplification. But this spectrum is really just one way to visualize the different sort of tiers of transparency. And so on the far left here, you have Israel, right? This is a country that does not even acknowledge that it possesses nuclear weapons. So as a result, there's basically zero official or even really media reporting about Israel's nuclear arsenal. The next group, which includes Pakistan, India, China, and North Korea, they do acknowledge nuclear possession, but most of what we can sort of glean about their arsenals comes from watching military parades or reading official press releases, which can sometimes provide very little information, or they can be exaggerated or manipulated. Secondary media reports about these arsenals are often tend to be quite exaggerated as well, so it requires a little bit of media literacy to distill the good information from the bad. Russia is sort of in a tier of its own because it actually publishes quite a bit of information, including annual interviews with its top generals, reveals a lot of information about its arsenal and nuclear policies. Additionally, it was up until very recently, or continues to be, depending on your interpretation, subject to an arms control treaty, New START, which meant that it had to publish or exchange data about numbers of deployed strategic nuclear forces. And that was a very valuable data source for us. Unfortunately, Russia suspended its participation in that treaty, as did the United States when they took what they call reciprocal countermeasures. And so we don't really have access to that data anymore, but we do have the historical data. Finally, you have the UK, France, and the USA. These countries all do publish quite detailed information on their nuclear arsenals, including budgetary data, technical data. With the exception of the US and France, no other nuclear armed state has ever made public statements about the exact size of its nuclear arsenal. This sort of broad range of secrecy standards is the result of a lot of different factors, right? History, governance, rule of law, public discourse, media independence, all sorts of things like that. As you can sort of see on this spectrum, it doesn't necessarily follow that more quote unquote democratic states are more open about their nuclear arsenals. That is sometimes the case in certain aspects, right? Because when you have more democratic states, they tend to have to respond to parliamentary inquiries or a robust news media. But on the other hand, you do have other countries, right, like North Korea, which is generally pretty open about its nuclear forces because they're trying to signal something to the West, right? But it's subject to exaggeration or manipulation. So you kind of have to like parse that through a little bit. It also takes a long time for a nuclear armed state to develop a culture of responsible transparency. And there are different ways in how countries sort of approach this. So I mentioned the secrecy. I'll just kind of briefly go over these, but really what we're seeing here is that even in the most open countries, right, like the US and the UK, officials do sometimes they withhold information because of secrecy or overclassification. That trend has worsened in recent years, and we've seen countries that previously have been among the most transparent that have begun to revert to sort of these Cold War era levels of nuclear opacity. So during the first Trump administration, they sort of reversed basically a decade's worth of Obama era transparency policies, and they refused to declassify the size of the US nuclear stockpile. This is something that our organization submits these declassification requests on an annual basis to the government, and usually they are responded to. The Trump administration refused to respond to them, and they basically wrote us back a letter that said, no, this isn't in the best interest. They say it's not in the best interests of the United States, which is an interesting way to respond to a declassification or FOIA request. It's not really the type of response that you would expect. Normally, you expect something that meets like a particular legal standard for why they're not able to respond. But here they just said, no, it's not, we don't want to. So you can sort of see there's a bit of a trend that's happening here. Similar things happen in the UK. They said in 2021, the UK will no longer give public figures for our operational stockpile, deployed warheads, or deployed missile launchers. This is probably done in an attempt to sort of mirror what the Trump administration was doing at the time. Occasionally, we do get some official declassifications that provide opportunities to validate our estimates, but those are kind of few and far between. So you can see, just some examples from 2009, in which, here was an estimate that we put out, right, 5,200 as the US stockpile. We got a quite a close number as a result. So you can sort of see like the methodology does sort of work, but it's rare that you get these kinds of disclosures. And each type of open source has, its distinct advantages and disadvantages. So I'll talk about those really quickly. The most reliable sources of nuclear weapons related information generally originate from national governments. And so those can include things like parliamentary testimonies, intelligence estimates, declassified documents, programmatic data and budgetary documents, military parades, which show things like missiles that we can measure and analyze to estimate performance, weapon system tests, treaty disclosure data, that sort of thing. Some concerns and challenges here. One is that there is a risk that state-originating data may include deliberate or inadvertent biases that could be subject to political motivation or influenced by some kind of like bureaucratic pressure. So for example, the United States every year they put out this report by the Pentagon that provides its assessment of Chinese military power, right, and how that's changing each year. Usually, this is a good source of data, but also, it's being produced by an adversarial country to China, whose mission, may or may not be tasked with estimating or assessing the worst case scenario, right, rather than the most likely scenario. Or perhaps there's institutional pressure to push on China being more of a threat because, there's industry pressure for the United States to produce more weapons or that sort of thing. So you have to be a little cognizant of like who is producing that data. I also mentioned certain intelligence or government agencies can be more hawkish than others, right? So some are indeed tasked with the worst case scenario, some are tasked with the most likely scenario. You have to sort of understand a little bit like what the differences between those things are. And also only some countries publish data about their nuclear forces, right? So this isn't sort of a blanket, thing that is useful because, when you're dealing with a country like Israel, you're not really going to get any state originating data at all, right? You sort of have to rely on other things. Another method is non-state originating data, right? So these might include things like news media, industry publications, think tanks, or other open source researchers. There are also some concerns and challenges here, right? So these all play a really important role in increasing transparency and policy accountability, but the quality of reporting really varies between outlets. It also varies between countries, it varies between organizations. So it's really important to develop these sort of like media literacy skills that you need in order to sort of disaggregate these. This can often be challenging, right? Because media reports about nuclear weapons often quote anonymous contributors or like someone involved in defense planning or an industry source, and they don't give readers any sense as to whether or not that specific source was speaking in an official capacity, or like, do they even have insight on the thing that they're talking about, or are they just like some guy? Like, really unclear. On top of that, you have media embellishment that is pretty common when it comes to nuclear weapons issues. This happens particularly in countries where governments do not reveal much information about their own nuclear forces. And so you can often get this like exaggeration or sensationalism effect that I talked about earlier. So for example, Indian media frequently tends to report that a particular missile system, the BrahMos, which is a cruise missile, they tend to just call that a nuclear capable cruise missile. There are no public official reports or statements that would credit the BrahMos system as having a nuclear capability. By all accounts, it is a non-nuclear capable system. US intelligence explicitly lists it as a non-nuclear capable system, and yet we tend to just sometimes have articles that are like, we want to make this weapon system sound scary, it's nuclear capable, right? And that just like isn't the case. The third methodology that I'll talk about is satellite imagery, right? So overall, the open source information landscape is changing really rapidly, but perhaps the most significant change is taking place in this sort of commercial satellite imagery space. And so we're now really at the point where improvements in commercial satellite imagery, plus this sort of proliferation of like high frequency, high resolution imagery on a near daily basis are now basically allowing independent researchers to use tools like Google Earth and things like that to track this micro level activity basically in real time. And so, for example, here are some various stories over the past few years that are really impressive, right? Researchers have been able to track sort of minute activity. You can see on the far left, we're just seeing effluent come out of a particular building, at a building where North Korea produces plutonium, right? On the right, we have this like missile launch that is captured while it's being launched, right? Like that is really incredible stuff, right? So, on rare occasions, we've also been able to capture some pretty significant changes to a country's nuclear policy, right? So folks may have seen that China is building hundreds of new ICBM silos, big change from its previous posture. This is something that various groups, various non-governmental groups, including our group, but again, others at CNS, at Air University, have been able to track sort of in minute real-time data, right, using satellite imagery. So there are a lot of different companies out there, and you can use different ones for different things. And so some companies, right, some like Google Earth Pro, they collect imagery from companies that image the Earth at a high resolution, but on a less frequent basis, right? You also have other companies, right, that are sort of on the flip side of the coin, like Planet Labs, right, which image the Earth on a near daily basis, but at a lower resolution. And then on top of that, you have companies that use different kinds of sensors, which allow you to get different types of images, right? So different sensors can pick up different spectral bands, which correspond to different types of data. So there's like a whole bunch of things here. I won't run through them all, but really, just noting that the satellite imagery space right now is kind of, it does feel a little bit like a massive bubble that's just happening. Like maybe it will never burst, but it's just like there are so many companies that are entering this space, and what this means for a researcher who's interested in non-proliferation is that you have access to a lot of different types of imagery and a lot of different types of sensor data, which is useful for being able to understand what a country is doing with their nuclear forces. There are two sort of key practices associated with this, right? So this is, you may have heard things like imagery interpretation or geolocation, right? These are really just, analyzing the contents of an image and then estimating its geographical position in space. And something that's really important to think about is that, it sort of seems perhaps like this type of work is incredibly specialized. You have to get like a serious degree in order to do this stuff. Like those things might help, but really, this is something that we do on a daily basis, right? When we are looking at our friends' Instagram photos, when we're looking at images in newspapers or on TV, really wherever, unconsciously we interpret information, and we sort of look at what we can see in that image, and we make assumptions about where that image is, what is in the image, and the degree of success that we have relates to how clear the image is, right? Is it blurry or not? But also things like our own innate experiences, right? So have we been to that place before? Do we recognize it? Did our friend, tell us that they were going to a particular place, right? And so we can match that with the image, right? There are all these things that we just do. And this is really something that's very human and sort of like within us already. And so if there's one kind of takeaway here is that really the sort of like, this may seem like it's like a highly specialized thing that only certain people have access to. A lot of these tools are free, and the knowledge of how to do this really is like a very innate human thing that anyone can do. It just requires practice because it really is like exercising a muscle. And so, for example, I throw this out there. I think most people on the call probably know exactly what city this is. They might even know exactly where this is without me telling you that this is in fact London, right? And there are a lot of reasons why you might think that, right? It might have to do with this famous underground sign, the cabs that are, very distinct, the double-decker bus, right? The architectural style, right? These are all like it's an English-speaking country, cars are driving on the right side of the road. Like there's so many different things about this image that sort of immediately click in your brain and say London. This is the exact same kind of thing that we do on a regular basis with imagery of nuclear forces. It just is more difficult when you're doing this in a military base or a country where you've never actually stepped foot. And so something that is, I think, really important to think about here is that what this sort of means is that we are all very different, we all have a lot of different experiences. We all come from diverse backgrounds. Those things help you as an imagery analyst, right? Your knowledge of something like architecture, of security culture, of how people in different countries might think, right? Those will all contribute to your ability to do this work well. It doesn't have to be, a specialized kind of training. So this is really just important for me to put out there that like the best imagery analysts have a lot of diverse experiences and work in diverse teams because everyone can sort of contribute their different experiences to bring this together. So some important things, right? So when you want to be performing this kind of work, right, you're really just trying to narrow down locations, right? So you're looking for indicators that are things like vegetation types, building styles, patterns of human activity, and then trying to match those up with very specific signatures that you can use to make a positive ID, right? So unique architectural features, distinctive road layouts, that sort of thing. And so I'll walk through a quick example and then we can sort of wrap up and get to our Q&A. But one example is nuclear weapons in Belarus. This has been a big topic of conversation, I think, over the past couple of years. I'll give some sort of background here. But since 2022, right, Russian and Belarusian leaders have made, a lot of statements about these plans to deploy Russian tactical nuclear weapons on Belarusian territory. This would be a really new development because Russia has not deployed nuclear weapons outside of its own territory since the end of the Cold War. On top of that, Russia has also spent many decades criticizing the fact that the US does this and deploys its nuclear weapons outside of its own territory at various NATO air bases in Europe. So now it's basically adopting the same practice. So this is the context for Russia's actions. But Russia's statements about deploying nuclear weapons have been really exaggerated. They've been confusing. Lots of different people have given lots of different statements. And so it's been very complicated to try and figure out what actually has been going on. And so overall, it seemed to include three elements, right? The training of Belarusian Su-25 pilots to deliver nuclear weapons, the transfer of Russian Iskander missile systems to Belarus, and the construction of what Putin called a quote-unquote special storage facility for nuclear weapons. These all created a lot of questions for our team, right? So specifically, which Belarusian airbase are we talking about, right? Where are these Iskanders going to be based? And the most important one, are nuclear weapons actually being stored in Belarus? So we'll watch really quickly this very short video together because this is an important data point, right? So Belarusian TV put out this short video basically showing Belarusian pilots having recently returned from their training mission in Russia with regards to nuclear weapons. And we have been, when this happened, we sort of looked at this video and were able to geolocate it based on what we could see in the background. So,
в рамках плановой подготовки летный инженерно-технический состав нашей авиационной базы прошел доподготовку в учебном центре Российской Федерации на самолетах Су-25. Это позволило нам не только улучшить свои практические навыки, но и освоить новые способы применения современных авиационных средств поражения, в том числе и специальных боеприпасов. Подготовка включала как теоретический курс, так и практические занятия под руководством российских инструкторов. Программа подготовки личным составом освоена в полном объеме. При необходимости полученные нами знания и умения мы готовы применить на практике для обеспечения военной безопасности как нашей страны, так и союзного государства в целом.
Okay, so very short video. We don't really get very much out of this, but we do get a few things, right? So we see these kinds of fuel tanks over here. We can see this plane, right? This is an Su-25 plane, which does narrow it down to just a few bases. We sort of see that it's like, we sort of see that it's in this kind of like divot area of there's sort of like a hill and then there's some concrete here. We can see these poles in the background. There's some trees, really not that much, but this was enough for us to be able to go through and geolocate exactly where this took place, right? So we were able to geolocate this to Lida Air Base, which is in western Belarus near the border with Poland. And we could see that through, there's these trees in the background, these little fuel tanks right here. And we were able to find the very specific sort of hard point that, or the revetment rather, where this plane where this video was being filmed. So now we know from here, this is Lida Air Base, right? And we could see that there are also, you know, sort of new munition storage facilities that were being built, that sort of thing. So, okay, so we've answered one of our questions, right? That doesn't necessarily indicate that nuclear weapons are on site here, but at least we know where this video was being filmed, right? So that helps us with a data point. So, now our next question, right? Where in Belarus are the Iskanders going to be based? We have another video here, also from Belarusian TV in 2022. So similar exercise. This one's a bit longer, so we're not gonna watch the whole thing. But you can see a few things here.
Самым весомым аргументом для тех, кто хотя бы в теории допускает возможность нападения на союзное государство. Ведь такого универсального ракетного оружия нет ни у кого в мире. Соприкоснуться с ним...
So we have this nice long building in the background.
Рекордсмен по упоминаниям в западной прессе. И все
We're in a forest.
без ядерной боеголовки. Он
move forward a little bit. We've got this kind of like, we're in this like nice forest area. We're not really seeing much else. Again, the long building. What else do we have?
И цели Искандер поражает для поражения наиболее посадочных площадок. А еще чувствует себя максимально. Ее также сопровождают.
There's this little building in the background. We have this garage.
Как и любое время возможности.
Okay, that's basically it. We don't really have a ton here. But we were also able to geolocate exactly where this base is using this video. So, what we found was that, you know, we found this at a training base near an area called Asipovici, and you could see sort of based on these various little like tracks here. We have this long building in the background right there. Over here we've got this like little ramp where the missile system was sitting on top of, and then these buildings in the background. This is like, I'm like running through this really quickly because it otherwise would take a very long time to like go through it all. But really, I think something that's important to note is like this work takes a long time, right? It really is going through like pixel by pixel on a lot of these different things to find stuff. You try and do what you can to narrow down what you're looking at, but these things like are possible, right? Even with a small amount of information in a video, it just requires like a level of patience and attention to detail and curiosity that can sometimes be in short supply because this work can also sometimes be very frustrating because you're looking at like an individual tree for a really long time being like, is that this tree? It's crazy. I mentioned the space. We've been watching this for quite some time. We can see the Iskanders there. Then our last question, right? Very important. Are nuclear weapons actually being stored in Belarus? And if so, where? Right, so we'd been watching these different facilities for some time, right? I mentioned Lida Air Base, I mentioned this Asipovici Iskander Depot, and then we got this really interesting piece of information, right? That I don't know if anyone remembers when that like guy from the Air National Guard leaked all of those documents through Discord. Like he was like in a video game like Discord server and then leaked a bunch of things. Anyways, one of the things that he leaked was a CIA assessment that a senior officer from the Russian MOD inspected a facility in the vicinity of Asipovici for potential upgrades to store nuclear weapons. This is, if you remember, the same deployment area as the Iskander base. So we were looking around and we noticed that there was this area, right? It's like this little area right here that here's what it looks like in 2019. And then here's what it looks like in 2024. Big changes. Right, and we started to see, right, this is very close to the Iskander base. We started to see the trees having been cleared, right, to about 20 meters of the fencing, which is a lot, right? You need tree clearance when you're in a secure area, because if you're putting up fences, you need to be able to see, you need to be able to like have sensors, and you don't want like random people coming out of the trees and basically walking onto your base. So you need to have a little bit of a clearance there. There's a multi-level security perimeter, or a multi-layered rather, which tends to be a big thing in Russia. It sort of resembles, this area sort of now is starting to resemble what we see in other Russian nuclear storage facilities. And so this is not definitive proof that there's nuclear weapons stored on site, but to my mind, if someone asked me what is the most likely candidate site for nuclear weapons to be stored in Belarus, I would say this site. Right? And so that's because of these various signatures and all of these other things that we've sort of put together as part of this broader investigation to understand a little bit more what's happening. So a quick wrap up. How are governments reacting to all of this? This is, quite a sea change, right? Because previously, this is something that, governments really for a long time held a monopoly on when they were able to release information, what kinds of information they wanted to release, how they wanted to release it. This is now changing, right? Really rapidly. Independent researchers are able to do this work basically on a daily basis. So how are they reacting? Badly. I would say they are largely defaulting to this sort of deeply held institutional practice towards secrecy and censorship. This may work when it comes to like FOIA documents, right? You mentioned, or I saw the declassification request that I put earlier in my slide. The US just denied that, right? And they said like, we don't want to give you this. It's not in our best interest. To some extent that works, right? Like I can't get that if they don't want to give it to me. This does not work for satellite imagery, right? It is really, really difficult to censor satellite imagery. That doesn't mean that we are not seeing governments try to do it, right? We've seen, for example, this is South Korea. South Korea Naver Maps, which is the sort of like local mapping software in South Korea. They sort of regularly paint over these sensitive sites with very obvious like fake mountains or trees. So this is like the former US forces in Korea headquarters in downtown Seoul. They just sort of like put a big mountain over it. This is obviously like not what Seoul looks like. So like clearly they are doing this kind of sloppily. Another pretty egregious example of censorship. This is from many years ago, from 2013. This is Volkel Air Base in the Netherlands. This is an air base that allegedly stores US nuclear weapons. And if you were to Google Earth, Volkel, you would get this image on the top, right, at the top area, which is not very helpful, right, because they tried to like pixelate over this. And so my colleague Hans actually purchased an image of Volkel Air Base from a Dutch satellite imagery provider, and the company sent him this like doctored image where like this is on the right over here is what it actually looks like, and this is what they sent him, right? They like sent him this image that like includes a forest and trees and a field and all this stuff. So this is like, this is examples of how governments and companies will try and censor things. But the challenge here is that, what will often happen is that basically now that anyone with an internet connection can access these types of imagery, it doesn't really make sense to stick with these censorship practices because it can often backfire and lead to attention being drawn to the exact sites that you're trying to hide, right? So this is something called the Streisand effect, in which this photographer in 2003 posted this photo of Barbara Streisand's mansion in Malibu, and then she reacted by suing him for like $10 million, and it was like some crazy thing, and it became this big lawsuit. This photo before the lawsuit had been seen 6 times, and then after the lawsuit, like a month later, it had been seen 420,000 times, right? So this is like a great example of how sometimes you are attempting to do secrecy, and in fact, you end up with the exact opposite of what you intended to do. Here's some examples also in Israel and Turkey. This is an investigation that I worked on where we noticed that Yandex, which is the Russian mapping service, was blurring out selectively imagery in Israel and Turkey. And so you would see like even just like entire apartment blocks that previously looked very innocuous that now all of a sudden clearly have some kind of political or military function. This became like kind of a big story. And so there is also like, I guess there are laws that are on the books that are able to censor satellite imagery right at certain resolutions. And so there's a US law, for example, that prohibits commercial satellite imagery of Israel at certain resolutions. And then the Trump administration actually, the first Trump administration actually changed that and made the threshold for imagery resolution higher in the case of Israel. So it actually meant that we were now able to access even better imagery of Israel than before. It's a little unclear why they did that, but it was a very welcome thing. So this is what imagery of a missile base in Israel looked like in 2019. This is what it looked like in 2021 after the law was revoked, or not revoked, but rather revised. And so you can sort of see like there are like laws do have an effect on this stuff, but generally speaking, it is quite hard to censor this kind of data. So I think I will wrap it up there for now. I've gone on long enough. I'm really looking forward to your questions, engagement, comments, and there's my email. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask or get in touch beyond this hour, feel free to do so. But thank you so much.
Brilliant. Please, if you have any questions, use the raise hand function or post your question in the chat. I can see we have a couple already, so I'll go straight to those. First, Said has asked, in times of crisis, how reliable could information obtained by OS be, as data points can easily be manipulated?
Oh man, that's a great question. In times of crisis, that is when it gets really it gets quite scary, to be honest, right? Because I think what we've sort of seen as a trend over these past several years is that when tensions are very high, relying on data that sort of gets proliferated through things like social media and Twitter and stuff like that can be very dangerous. And there are a lot of examples of things that have spun out of control or have sort of like changed the narrative about the nature of a crisis entirely because they were false, but getting spread very widely on social media. So for example, in I forget what year this was, but during the Beirut port explosion, which was a really horrific and tragic incident, there were various kind of like major accounts that were spreading disinformation that suggested that this happened because Israel had like nuked Lebanon, because the explosion like vaguely looked like a mushroom cloud. That got like millions of views, engagements, and it was completely wrong, right? Like that kind of thing can be, quite dangerous to do in the context of, especially in the context of world leaders who are very receptive and responsive to social media. So Trump is a great example. He's on social media all the time. And if there are people tweeting out like, something is happening in the world of nuclear weapons, like there's a truck with nukes that are rolling down the street in Russia or something like that, and it just like isn't correct, that doesn't mean that he isn't going to respond in a way that doesn't increase nuclear tensions. And so I would say like the sort of like social mediaification of open source information is not a good trend, I would say.
Very much. Next question comes from Felipe. How important is it to study weapon systems and their capabilities to understand international relations today? If it's important, how can we convince students who do not enjoy strategic studies and related subjects of this importance? In my opinion, some states may express certain intentions, but when we examine the weapons they're developing and how they train to use them, we can more clearly understand their political intentions. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. It's a great question. Yeah, I would say it is very important, right? Because generally speaking, in order for declaratory policy to be meaningful in any way, it has to be matched to the capabilities that the country deploys and exercises. And so, for example, we will often see campaigns, right, in the United States in particular, for the US to adopt a no first use policy. This sounds great in theory, and I would welcome it. But if all they do is write no first use right on a piece of paper and not make any meaningful changes to their force posture or the capabilities of their weapon systems, then it is functionally, I don't want to say it's meaningless, but it probably is not doing what we want it to do, right? And so these things have to go hand in hand. And so I do think a careful study of what the weapon systems roles and missions are is equally as important as studying the intentions of the states themselves as it gets written on paper, because those things have to go hand in hand. Does that answer your question? I think it's a really important one.
Thanks for that. Feel free to respond, Felipe. Let's look down. Sarah added some context about the change to the US law on blurring satellite imagery from Israel. Apparently that was because the competitors were already providing much more detailed imagery. Let's take a question from let's just see what's questions. You mentioned that US intelligence assessments of Chinese military capabilities, like the annual Pentagon reports, might reflect worst-case scenario analysis due to institutional or industry pressures rather than most likely scenarios. How do you triangulate between potentially inflated official assessments and satellite imagery evidence you're finding? For example, with the Chinese ICBM silo construction the team discovered, how do you avoid either understating the threat by dismissing official estimates or overstating it by taking imagery at face value without understanding operational intent?
Oh, it's a phenomenal question. Yeah, we do it by really trying to match what we are seeing with these sort of intelligence assessments with what we can see on our end. And really, like, I think this comes down to an important point here, which is that yes, military remote sensing and satellite observation capabilities are better than what is out in the open source, right? The US military has better satellites than we do, but they are not that much better than what we have. Right? Like we know what the US has, right? Because, for example, like Trump tweeted it out, right? A few years ago, he tweeted out that image of the Iranian missile launch failure. And why that was so interesting was not like what was in the content of the image, but about the resolution of the image. And a lot of imagery analysts were like, whoa, okay, so like that's what they have, right? Like that's how good their satellites are. It's pretty good. Like you can see a lot of minute data, but we can also get almost to that level of minute detail by sort of mixing and matching our different companies that we work with and using different types of sensors like thermal and synthetic aperture radar and all this stuff. So with that in mind, when I read something in the US intelligence estimate, right, that says some of China's new ICBM silos have been loaded, right, which is a statement that they say. My assumption there is, okay, so then if I go through and try and find this, I should be able to see this. And if I can't see it, what it either means is I have done a bad job at looking, but like I generally trust myself to do a good job. Or the US is getting that information through things that we can't access in the open source, which either means like human intelligence or signals intelligence, which, like, fair enough, I'm not going to get that info. Or they have some kind of satellite capability that is just like so much better than what we have. But I really don't think that that is the case. And I think that based on like a loading operation, right? You brought this up in your example, a silo loading operation, that's something that takes like 12 hours, right? And assuming that they're doing this like 120 times for each of those, or sorry, like 350 times, right? For like each of those different silos, we should be lucky enough to catch one of them. And so my thinking here is basically like I have to go in and verify it for myself. Otherwise, I can't take it at face value. And so I can repeat the Pentagon's claims and I can say, this is what the Pentagon says. But I personally, until I see it on my end, I'm hesitant to come out and agree with their assessment until I can see it for myself. And if I can't see it for myself and they still continue to push that, then I start to think, okay, I wonder if they are making that assumption not based on something they can see, but because of maybe human or signals intelligence, which, you know, is really is impossible for me to verify. And that's when I would maybe even start to talk to people on the inside a little bit and sort of ask like, is this something I'll be able to see, or is this something I won't be able to see? And maybe they might be able to give me a little bit of like a thumbs up, thumbs down indication.
Thanks very much. Our next question is from Marciano. Is your team divided on specific regions? I'm particularly interested in East Asia. Would you say it is more challenging to conduct your research there, especially in China? And reflecting on one of your answers, does Chinese nuclear army posture support its no first use policy?
Yeah, great question. So we're not really divided into regions because unfortunately there are only 4 of us. We're a very small team. And so we sort of have to jump around a little bit based on like what is relevant, what's in the news, like what are the things that we need to focus on. So we're not, I wouldn't say we're regionally divided. If we had a much larger team, we probably would be, but that's kind of where we're at. Your second question is a great one, right? And this is sort of something that I think that many folks are debating right now, right? That in the U.S. intelligence estimate, the assessment of the Pentagon seems to be that China's no first use policy really does not hold water anymore because of its new posture, right? And its new, you know, these new ICBMs and all those things. I view it a little differently. I think I can sort of see like both sides of this one. And I think there is a reading that you can make of China's statements that can incorporate all of these new ICBMs and new things that they're building into their existing posture. And I think there's a reading where you can argue that all of these new systems have necessitated a change to their posture. I'm sympathetic to both because I don't think we really have a clear sense of what it is yet. And I do, I sort of have a little bit of skepticism about the value of a no first use policy when in the midst of a crisis anyways, especially when you come to leaders that are very sort of like narcissistic or involved are operating in sort of an authoritarian or like yes man context, which I think, to be honest, like almost every nuclear armed country's leader is operating in. This is not like a China specific argument. So I do think that like it depends on how they want to use these ICBMs, right? If they want to use them the same way that the United States or Russia thinks about theirs, right? Especially the United States as a form of damage limitation, then yeah, I think it does not really work with a no first use policy, right? Because presumably you are going to be launching those pretty early in a crisis to be able to limit the amount of damage coming back towards you. But that would be like a very big change from China's traditional nuclear policies. And I also think there is a world in which they decided to build these for reasons that don't have to do with damage limitation, right? Maybe it's just like upping the ante for the US to be able to do a first strike, given increases in US surveillance and intelligence and reconnaissance and better US conventional counterforce. So like there's a world in which they just say like, yeah, no, our posture is the same. We just like need more ICBMs now in order to make our posture more credible. So there's like there's a reading of Chinese policy where things stay the same. They can tell themselves that they're keeping with this no first use policy and still build these. There's also a reading where, the US Pentagon says that they're making a total policy change, and that's also possible. It's just kind of hard to know from the outside.
Our next question is from Maria. Is there a specific software you use to analyze imagery manipulation?
Yeah.
How can you estimate that the process of imagery interpretation was done in a good way, either by AI or humans?
This is really hard. Really difficult. I will say I'm not at present worried that the data that I am receiving directly from satellite imagery companies is being manipulated. I know I like showed that image of the like Dutch imagery provider where like they did that. I just based on the imagery that we're like currently getting, which is either from pretty like reputable major government providers like Maxar now, which is now called Vantor. They provide us, imagery that I think is quite reputable, and I think is, we trust that. In addition, we can, we get data from NASA, that sort of thing, right? Like these are providers that I think are quite good. I'm much more nervous about like photographs. I think photographic manipulation is like widespread at this point. I don't think that genie gets put back in the bottle. There are programs that you can use. You really kind of have to know how to use them, and it's really hard, right? So there's a program, for example, called Forensically, which you can like input a photo and then you can like sort of mess with the different like attributes and things, and it might give you a sense of like, has this been manipulated or not? You still really have to know what you're looking for, and to be honest, like I personally feel a little out of my depth whenever I try and do that with a photograph, because it's incredibly challenging. I've yet to really see that with satellite imagery, like on a widespread use, other than being done in this like very clumsy way. And so I think the one other thing that's really nice about satellite imagery is that, unlike a photograph, you can always cross-reference it, right? So like if you're getting imagery from a company and you are nervous about it, or you see it on Google and you're like, something's weird, it's gotten blurred out, like go to Bing, right? A thing that no one has ever said. Go to Bing, go to Yandex, go to another company, and because they are all subject to different jurisdictions and have different laws associated with them, like they'll give you a different image. And so you can always cross-reference. Photographs are much harder.
That's amazing.
Thanks.
I'm
going to avoid the temptation to go off on a tangent about the British royal family and their bad doctoring of photographs. We've got a question that's directly follows on from that one, so I'll go to the next. Related to Maria's question, what impact does AI have on the analysis of OSINT? Does it facilitate the process? Can it replace human instinct?
Oh, so good. So, we're experimenting with this, right? I think a lot of folks are. There are kind of the most clear way in which AI can be useful is through pattern recognition, right? This is something that AI is like very good at. And so, in theory, you can, um, give a model training data, right? You can say like, hey, here's like 50 images of a silo. Now go find me like another 50. And it will maybe do an okay job of that. It depends on how good your training data is. You do run into some like weird questions about legality and stuff like that because like whose company is involved in training the data, whatever. Like from what I've seen, I think it would be quite difficult for like a third party researcher to build an imagery training model because I think you would run into these like various legal questions about like how you're allowed to train your data and then like where do you kind of like sick the model onto. What we've seen is that the companies themselves are starting to build these models, right? So like Vantor, has their own version of like object recognition. And so, it has trained the model on things like aircraft, right? And you can then like put the little area that you want to look at, and then it will like search its own imagery, right? Because that's where it has the rights to be able to do that. Those do work, right? It's going to get a lot better. I'd say right now we're still kind of in the early stages of like how useful this is. I do think you're never really going to be able to get to a point in which it will totally replace a human, right? Because like I've messed around with a few of these and it delivers me a bunch of things that it's like, check it out. I found like a missile launcher. And then I look at it and it's like a splotch on the road. And I'm like, all right, that's not anything, right? Like, so, you still need human eyes to be able to go through because an AI is never going to have the kind of like cultural context, the things that I was talking about earlier, like all those sensitivities that we bring as human beings into an investigation. And so like it might be able to measure things really well or point out patterns and stuff, but like I don't think we will get replaced. I'm not really worried about that. So right now I view it as like a useful tool for me, as long as it continues to improve. Right now I've haven't found it overwhelmingly featuring in my research because I'm kind of waiting for it to evolve a little bit.
Thanks so much. We have a few more questions. I think if we just ask one from Pablo, we'll have had taken one question from everyone who's posed one. So I think that's what I'm going to do. Pablo's question was, during the lecture, you mentioned that there might be a bubble in the making in the satellite imagery market with more and more companies entering it. Although this can be seen as positive due to the increase in the number of sources, which is essential to gather contrasted data, you were just talking about this, could it also have a detrimental effect due to overinformation? What might complicate reaching conclusions and thus favoring to some extent the secrecy surrounding these sites?
It's a good question. I don't know if I would see it that way. I think at least from my like I can only view this from the perspective of like of an imagery analyst and someone who like wants as much imagery as possible. For me, like I would always take more imagery over less imagery. Even imagery that like may on the surface not seem particularly useful. I'd still rather have it. Like I welcome as many companies who want to enter the space and like give me free imagery as possible, especially because most companies do because they're all trying to differentiate from one another, they do tend to like provide different types of things. And so what I've found is the best analysis uses a lot of different data sources rather than just relying on one individual imagery source. And so in that sense, I would always rather have more. Yeah. That's just my perspective though, as like as an imagery analyst. Like I'm greedy. I want as much imagery as possible. Maybe others will see it differently.
I certainly think I'd agree with that. Well, that's everything, all the time that we have for questions. Thank you so much, of course, Matt, first of all, for a brilliant talk and for answering all the questions. Thanks to everyone who posed them and everyone else in the audience for joining us. I think you'll agree it's been a really fascinating masterclass and I've really enjoyed it myself. So I hope you'll join us the next time we have one of these and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you for your questions. Really, this has been great.